After General Hasdrubal the Fair was assassinated by a Celtic slave, 26-year-old Hannibal was elected as the new Carthaginian commander. The young general immediately made plans to invade Rome, but he couldn't begin the campaign before strengthening Carthage's control over the Iberian Peninsula. So Hannibal went to work. He launched 2 highly successful campaigns in 221 and 220 BC, extending Carthaginian influence beyond the Tagus River. But while on the return route to New Carthage, Hannibal was taken by surprise by a coalition of Iberian tribes. Led by the Carpetani tribe, the Iberians assembled a large army. They blocked Hannibal's path and fortified their position against the Tagus River, then waited for the Carthaginian general to attack. Here, Hannibal showed his military genius for the first time. Instead of attacking the Iberians head-on, he erected his own fortified camp and waited. By day's end, his scouts found a river crossing to the southeast. During the wee hours of the night, Hannibal ordered a small contingent to stay in the camp and keep all campfires burning, creating the illusion that the whole Carthaginian army was still encamped. Meanwhile, he led his army on a swift flanking maneuver further up the river. By sunrise the next day, Hannibal was behind the Iberian position, feigning retreat towards New Carthage. Thinking that the Carthaginians were retreating, the Iberians rushed to intercept them. But once they were midstream, Hannibal sprung his trap and unleashed his cavalry. Iberian infantrymen, chest deep in the fast-flowing river, couldn't offer much resistance and were cut down with ease by the Carthaginian cavalry charge. Those who managed to cross were trampled by the elephants. By now the Iberian army lost all cohesion and the mass of tribal warriors started fleeing. Hannibal ordered his army to pursue them across the river, completely routing the enemy. On the Tagus River, Hannibal had his first major victory, but Rome took notice. Wanting to stop Hannibal's expansion, the Romans made their presence felt. Already allied with the wealthy and powerful city of Saguntum, Rome declared it their protectorate, an act that Hannibal perceived as a violation of the treaty signed by the 2 great powers in 225 BC, which divided the Iberian Peninsula along the Ebro River into Carthaginian and Roman spheres of influence. A sworn enemy of Rome, it didn't take long before Hannibal acted. He marched on Saguntum and besieged the city. In 219 BC, the Carthaginian army reached the outskirts of Saguntum. The city was heavily fortified, situated atop steep slopes and cliffs, high above the surrounding plain. Saguntines requested aid from Rome, but the Romans were busy fighting the Illyrians. Nevertheless, with provisions stockpiled, Saguntum was prepared. Besieging it would not be easy. Hannibal installed a blockade around the entire city and placed most of his forces at the western end. Saguntines stubbornly kept pushing every Carthaginian assault back, but the siege went on for months, and the many assaults gradually wore down portions of the wall. Eventually, the defenders had to abandon their outer defenses and form up behind the inner wall. Slowly and relentlessly, Hannibal's army made progress. And after 8 brutal months, the Saguntines made their last stand at the citadel. Soon after, the city fell. Inhabitants that survived the siege were either killed or sold into slavery. After the fall of Saguntum, Rome demanded justice for what they perceived was the violation of the treaty, and, claiming that Saguntum was in the Roman sphere of influence according to the treaty, they asked Carthage to hand over Hannibal to Rome so he can be punished. But the Carthaginian Senate stood by their general, and by the end of the year, the Second Punic War began. Hannibal wintered in New Carthage, preparing for the upcoming campaign. He placed his brother Hasdrubal in charge of Iberia, with 15,000 troops and 21 elephants, along with a fleet of ships to protect the coastline. To break possible tribal allegiances, around 15,000 Iberian infantry were swapped for 15,000 African infantry, who were more reliable, sending the Iberians to Carthage and Libya to bolster defences against a possible Roman landing. And in the spring of 218 BC, with the full support from the Senate, Hannibal marched out of New Carthage with 54,000 infantry and 8,000 cavalry, dividing his army into 3 columns. But beyond the Ebro, tribes allied to Rome were hostile to the Carthaginians, and it took Hannibal about 2 months to pacify the region. He placed around 10,000 troops under the command of Hanno, ordering him to establish a line of defense on the Ebro against possible incursions into Carthaginian territory. With 38,000 infantry, 7,000 cavalry, and 37 elephants left at his disposal, Hannibal crossed the mountains and encamped on the other side of the Pyrenees. Meanwhile, the Romans divided their forces. Their plan was to send Consul Publius Cornelius Scipio to intercept Hannibal in Iberia. Simultaneously, Consul Tiberius Sempronius Longus sailed to Sicily, with the intent of attacking Carthage itself if Scipio managed to stop Hannibal's advance. Additional Roman forces were left to guard the recently conquered Gallic lands in the Po Valley, a region the Romans called Cisalpine Gaul. Back at the foot of the Pyrenees Mountains, Hannibal laid the groundwork for the invasion. Rather than fighting his way towards Rome, he did everything to avoid conflict with the Gallic tribes, mostly paying them for free passage through their territory, promising that his only interest is to fight Rome. Moreover, Carthaginian messengers returning from the Po Valley assured Hannibal that the Gallic tribes there would welcome him, and that they had already begun hostilities against Rome in anticipation of his arrival. This was welcome news for Hannibal, because he knew the Po Valley could provide more manpower and act as a staging point for operations into Roman territory. As Hannibal approached the River Rhone, Scipio's army disembarked at Massalia to resupply, while on their way to Iberia. The Roman general knew that Hannibal crossed the Pyrenees, but he wrongly estimated that the Carthaginian general was still far from the Rhone. In truth, Hannibal's army was only 4 days' march away from Massalia. Hannibal rested his army for 3 days in hostile territory and began preparations to cross the Rhone. With the Roman army just 4 days away, Hannibal wanted to avoid a set-piece battle with the Gauls, eager to press on towards the Italian peninsula as soon as possible. But on the opposite riverbank, encamped was the army of the Cavaras tribe, a Roman ally. They gathered all their boats and built a barrier on the riverbank, in preparation to contest the Carthaginian crossing. But Hannibal devised a cunning plan. On the 3rd night, under the cover of darkness, he sent a flanking detachment under the command of Hanno, son of Bomilcar, some 40 kilometers, 25 miles, north. Hanno crossed the river and rested his troops for 1 day. On the 2nd night after leaving the Carthaginian camp, Hanno's detachment again moved during the night, eventually deploying behind the Cavaras camp at dawn. The trap was set. Early next morning, Hanno used smoke to signal Hannibal to start crossing the Rhone. As the Carthaginian vessels were lowered into the massive river, Cavaras' army formed a line on the opposite riverbank. Hannibal was one of the first to cross, to the roars and cheers from his men on the western bank. As the Carthaginians started disembarking on the eastern riverbank, Hanno sent a part of his force to loot and destroy the Cavaras' camp, while he personally led the charge against the Gauls near the river. The Kavaras were stunned by the flanking maneuver, and they began fleeing the field in panic, unable to cope with Hannibal's perfectly synchronized attacks. With the Gauls scattered, the battle was soon over, and the Carthaginians hastily proceeded to cross the river. Most of Hannibal's troops crossed the Rhone by the end of the day, while it took another day to get the elephants across the river. While the Carthaginian army gathered on the eastern bank, friendly Gallic messengers from the tribes in the Po Valley arrived, warning Hannibal that a Roman fleet is anchored nearby. Hannibal sent his scouts to locate Scipio's army, and, incredibly, not long after, his Numidian scouts stumbled into a Roman Gallic scouting party. Both generals now knew of each other's whereabouts. Scipio quickly moved north to confront Hannibal, but by the time the Romans reached the crossing point a few days later, only an empty Carthaginian camp was left behind. Hannibal had no time to waste. He had to reach the Alps before the winter. But trouble was brewing in Iberia. Scipio placed his brother, Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio Calvus, in charge of leading the army into Iberia, while he headed back to the Po Valley to assume command of Roman troops there and prepare for the Carthaginian invasion. Scipio Calvus, now in charge of the invasion force, disembarked at Emporia. The Greek trading cities and the Iberian tribes in the region welcomed the Romans. But even prior to the arrival of Roman troops, the Carthaginians began to lose control over the conquered region, as Hanno's force wasn't large enough to conduct offensive operations. What's worse, Hanno only learned about the Roman arrival when Scipio Calvus was well on his way towards the Ebro River. He sent word to Hasdrubal, who began marching north with 8,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry. But instead of waiting for Hasdrubal, Hanno marched out with 10,000 troops to meet the 20,000-strong Roman army. Scipio Calvus easily crushed the Carthaginians, killing 6,000 and capturing 2,000 troops, along with Hanno himself. Once Hasdrubal arrived, he didn't have enough troops to meet the Romans in battle, so he launched fast-moving raids along the coast. Carthaginian raiders killed many Roman sailors as they were foraging, reducing the effectiveness of the Roman fleet by half. Nevertheless, Rome now had full control over Iberia, north of the Ebro River, a serious blow to the Carthaginian war effort. Moreover, northern Iberia would become a base of operations for Roman incursions into Carthaginian territory south of the Ebro River. Meanwhile, having marched his forces over the Alps, Hannibal would soon turn the Italian peninsula into a war zone, in a campaign that would elevate him to a general of legendary status. It is the year 218 BC. As Roman legions under consul Tiberius Sempronius Longus sail south to invade Carthage itself, Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio Calvus is consolidating Rome's position in Iberia, while his brother, consul Publius Cornelius Scipio, rushes back to the Po Valley to take command of the Roman army there and stop Hannibal. Both sides are confident of victory. Although the Carthaginians are faced with serious setbacks in Iberia, in Gaul Hannibal speeds up his approach to the Alps when he befriends the Allobroges tribe by adjudicating in a dispute between two royal brothers over who should rule. The seemingly grateful new ruler of the tribe, Brancus the Elder, provides the Carthaginians with supplies, warm clothes, food, and guides. And so begins Hannibal's perilous journey through the Alps. But as the ascent begins, Brancus's friendly guides turn home. Here, Hannibal shows he is as skillful in mind games as he is in generalship. Sensing an ambush, he sends scouts ahead who report that the tribesmen are indeed mustering their forces just ahead on higher ground near their settlement, waiting to attack the passing Carthaginian column. With a select group of experienced troops, Hannibal sneaks up to a position overlooking the tribal settlement and plans his next move. As night falls, he signals his army to proceed marching. Spotting the movement, tribal sentries raise the alarm and, just as Hannibal had hoped, an attack begins on the Carthaginian column. Expecting the impending attack, Carthaginian troops below stand fast on the precipice. A swarm of tribal warriors smashes into their solid defensive line, the initial push throwing many over the cliff's edge. But the Carthaginians hold their ground, and the tribesmen soon realize that they have fallen into a trap. Hannibal rushes downhill, while Carthaginian troops from below simultaneously begin pushing uphill. Many tribesmen are cut down in a matter of minutes, their morale broken by the lightning-fast Carthaginian counterattack. With the enemy driven off, Hannibal and his men turn their attention towards the village. They storm the tribal settlement and seize all of their winter provisions. At dawn, the Carthaginian march resumes. Over the following 3 days, the marching column continues unopposed. But all that changes on the 4th day, as the Carthaginians enter a narrow gorge where they are met by several tribal chiefs who offer friendship, hostages, and guides. Suspecting that the Gallic tribes from these parts are no friendlier, Hannibal accepts their offer, but takes precautions by secretly moving the vulnerable baggage train and cavalry to the front of the column, and positions his heavy infantry in the rear. As the Carthaginian march continues through the extremely narrow pass, the 200-meter vertical cliffs ominously tower over them. And they are not alone. The Gallic warriors are watching from above. Having set up an ambush further up the gorge, the tribesmen bide their time, shadowing Hannibal's army for 2 days. But suddenly, at a very narrow point in the gorge, the Carthaginian column gets blocked from the front as the tribesmen unleash their attack. Rocks and projectiles rain down from the cliffs above onto the Carthaginians below, killing many in the process. Animals panic and trample over soldiers who hopelessly look for cover. The main Gallic force appears behind the Carthaginian column and charges their rear, expecting weakest resistance there as they hope to loot and destroy their supply train. But again, Hannibal proves he is one step ahead of his opponents, as the heavy Carthaginian infantry he previously placed in the rear pushes back the Gallic charge and inflicts heavy losses on the enemy, forcing them to retreat after a brief battle. Hannibal then urges his men to push forward out of the killing zone, as the barrage of rocks from above continues. It is not until 1 day later that the Carthaginians finally reach safety on the other side of the gorge. The last of the Allobrosia's attacks is beaten off, but the remorseless fighting against the Gallic tribes took its toll on Hannibal's army. To make matters worse, the weather soon turns as winter comes early. Hannibal's troops find themselves battling heavy snowstorms. Traversing through rocky gorges and steep mountain slopes, many are swallowed by treacherous voids lurking just under the snowfall. Men, animals, and wagons slip and slither on the ice towards precipitous ravines and treacherous chasms. Finally, 9 days into the march, the Carthaginians set up camp just below the top of the pass as they wait for stragglers to catch up. 2 days later, Hannibal rallies his troops at the top and points to the panorama of Italy below. There he vows to his men, "You will have the capital of Italy, the citadel of Rome, in the hollow of your hands." And with that, they begin descending towards the Po Valley. But the slopes on the way down are far steeper and largely covered in ice. The treacherous terrain claims the lives of many more troops and animals. Adding to the hardship, a collapsed stretch of road forces the Carthaginian column to stop for 3 days amidst freezing conditions while the road is repaired. But finally, after braving these horrific conditions, the Carthaginians reach the foot of the Alps. Having lost nearly half of his army, Hannibal takes stock of his troops who suffered terribly during the crossing. Of the 45,000 that set off through the Alps just 16 days ago, only 26,000 made it to the other side. There, the Roman army awaits. In late 218 BC, Hannibal marched his forces over the Alps. But before he can confront the Romans, he first tackles his 3 immediate priorities. He resupplies and rests his exhausted men, begins rebuilding his army by recruiting new contingents of Gallic troops from the Po Valley, as his current army is only barely equal in size to a single Roman consular army. And as soon as his troops are rested, he quickly moves to secure the loyalty of Gallic tribes. Aware that loyalty, or at least compliance, cannot be guaranteed by flattery and gifts alone, Hannibal asserts his authority by making an example of the Taurini tribe, who resisted the Carthaginian advance. After a 3-day siege, he orders his troops to storm the main town of the Taurini. All of the inhabitants, men, women, and children, are massacred. This calculated display of ruthlessness serves to show the Gallic tribes what is the price of hostility to the Carthaginian cause. Meanwhile, on the waves off the coast of Sicily, the Carthaginians strike the first blow. In preparation for a full-scale invasion to take back the important port cities that they once held, their ships begin raiding strategic islands around Sicily. In the west, the operation is successful. But further east, while raiding the Vulcan Islands, a few Carthaginian ships are blown off course in a terrible storm. Not far from the Straits of Messina, they are eventually spotted and attacked by the Syracusan navy. The Roman ally captures 3 Carthaginian ships and their crews. Under torture, the seamen reveal details about the Carthaginian plan to attack Sicily. The Syracusan king informs his allies of this, and the Roman praetor in Sicily reacts promptly. The Romans learned that the Carthaginians have a larger fleet in the area, but that their ships are not packed with many soldiers. The Roman praetor decides to exploit this by packing each of his ships with twice as many legionnaires, effectively enabling each Roman ship crew to fight off 2 Carthaginian ships. With lookout posts set up along the shore, the Roman ambush is set. The Carthaginians close in unopposed, but as they approach their intended target, the Romans go on the offensive. They direct their ships towards one part of the Carthaginian fleet, rushing to board the enemy. In this 1 versus 1 situation, the more numerous Roman crews overwhelm the Carthaginian ships and quickly pick them off one by one. Eventually, the Carthaginian naval attack is defeated, and their attempt to gain a foothold on the island of Sicily in 218 BC fails. By this time, Consul Tiberius Sempronius Longus arrives and launches a counteroffensive along the south coast of Sicily and manages to capture Malta. He then turns back to intercept Carthaginian ships that are raiding the Vulcan Islands, Vibo and Brutium. But Longus's mission is cut short by news that Hannibal arrived in the Po Valley, and he gets summoned to bring his legions back north to help Scipio. Meanwhile, Scipio is eager to meet Hannibal in battle. With his 17-year-old son at his side, also named Publius, who will later become known as Scipio Africanus, Scipio crosses the river Po at Placentia and promptly continues west along the northern bank of the Po. Under his command are mostly less experienced troops, but Scipio is confident of defeating Hannibal. After all, in Scipio's view, he challenged Hannibal on the Rhone, and the Carthaginian general ran away. Hannibal, on the other hand, is quite surprised to learn that Scipio made it back to the Po Valley so quickly. He thinks that Scipio returned with his entire army, but he has no way of knowing that in fact Scipio's troops continued on to Iberia. Thinking that the Romans now have 2 whole armies in the Po Valley, the Carthaginian general fears that this force is now strong enough to deter Gallic tribes from joining him, and he wants a victory, fast. Hannibal knows that the Gallic tribes will not rally to his banner if he doesn't seem confident of defeating Rome. Not wasting any time, he marches his army downstream along the northern bank of the Po River to meet Scipio. Still unaware of each other's exact whereabouts, the 2 generals send scouting parties well ahead of their respective armies as they march towards each other. Each army's scouts soon report the enemy's presence, and both Hannibal and Scipio proceed with caution. The Romans build a pontoon bridge over the Tichinus River and set up camp on the western bank. Meanwhile, some 15 kilometers west, the Carthaginian column also stops and encamps for the night on the flat plain. A day later, both Hannibal and Scipio ride out in force to scout the area in person, each of them eager to gain a crucial early victory, which would inspire the rest of their troops and win support of the Gallic tribes. Hannibal rides with the bulk of his horsemen, while Scipio has all of his cavalry and a small force of Velitus with him. As the 2 contingents move through the flat plain, they soon spot each other because of the clouds of dust thrown up by the hooves of their horses. Both generals decide to deploy their troops for battle. Hannibal arrays his close-order Spanish cavalry in the front and forms the Numidian light cavalry in 2 groups behind the first line. Scipio places his Velitus in the front, aiming to soften up Hannibal's cavalry with javelin throws. Gallic allies form the second line, while the Roman cavalry is in reserve. As both contingents begin closing the distance, Hannibal sees that the Roman cavalry is fewer in number and makes a split-second decision not to engage in skirmishing with the Roman Velitus. Instead, he orders a full-blooded charge against the Roman front line. Scipio quickly responds by leading his cavalry forward, as the Velitus withdraw through the gaps to form a second line, without even managing a single javelin volley due to the onrushing Carthaginians. A few moments later, the cavalry clashes in the center. A fierce, bloody, static melee develops, unlike the usual mobile cavalry encounters of the time. The horses panic in the chaotic close quarters fighting, and many horsemen dismount in order to fight more effectively on foot. For a while the fighting seems indecisive, but this was another ruse by Hannibal. He waits until most of the Roman cavalry is fully committed, and then sends his Numidians on a flanking maneuver. This catches the Romans totally by surprise. Velitus on the flanks spot the envelopment, and some of them panic and flee. The fast Numidian cavalry quickly flows around the Roman flanks and tramples over the scattered light infantry. And then the noose begins to tighten around the Roman contingent. In the melee, Scipio is struck down from his horse. Carthaginian troops close in to finish off the wounded general, but at the final moment he is rescued. One early account of his rescue holds that a Ligurian slave saved the Roman consul. but the more popular version claims that his 17-year-old son Publius charged to rescue his father with a small group of Roman cavalry that clustered around the consul before retreating back towards the Roman camp. As word of Hannibal's victory spreads, Gallic tribes send emissaries to pledge their support. But despite their promises, the Gauls deliver little in the way of reinforcements and supplies during this early stage of the war. This forces Hannibal, whose army goes critically low on food in late 218 BC, to send a cavalry contingent to capture a Roman grain depot at Clastidium, guarded by a Roman garrison. Luckily for Hannibal, the garrison commander is from Brundisium in southern Italy, and when confronted he willingly surrenders the depot and, in return for 400 gold pieces, joins the Carthaginian ranks together with the entire garrison. These troops become the first of the Italian allies to defect and join Hannibal. Meanwhile, the Roman army retreats to Placentia, where they plan to wait for Sempronius and his consular army. Although the defeat at the river Ticinus is far from a major loss, it nevertheless reinforces the apprehension with which the Romans would view Hannibal from now on, and it sets a psychological tone which would be felt in the much larger battles to come. After the defeat at Ticinus, the Roman Senate looks to save face by blaming Gallic allies for being ineffective. Taking comfort in the fact that Hannibal has yet to face the vaunted Roman infantry, long as his arrival to northern Italy restores confidence. Hannibal now faces armies of both Roman consuls. It's early December 218 BC. Publius Scipio's life still hangs in the balance due to wounds he sustained at Ticinus. But, ironically, his troubles are only just starting. His defeat at Ticinus has major consequences for Rome. It directly caused the garrison at Clastidium to surrender the town's massive grain depot. This strips his army of food reserves and disrupts his supply lines, making any advance into enemy territory a risky venture. At the same time, Hannibal finally replenishes his own reserves, which were dwindling ever since he descended from the Alps, right until the clash at Ticinus just a few days ago. The damage to Roman prestige raises the danger of further defections. What's worse, Gallic tribes are flocking to join Hannibal, enthused by his ability to defeat the Romans and his softer administrative touch. Scipio has no option but to retreat, realizing he is deep in hostile territory. He marches to Placentia and makes camp across the Po River. Hannibal pursues and catches up 2 days later. Learning of his arrival, over 2,000 Gauls allied to Rome rise up in the camp and attack Roman soldiers, killing many in their sleep. Before sunrise, they cross the Trebia to join Hannibal, bringing with them the severed heads of slain Romans. Using the Gallic defection as propaganda, Hannibal makes sure to spread the word that Rome's allies are joining him en masse, thereby boosting his popularity among the tribes. Scipio again moves south, not wanting to risk being caught in the open. A day later he reaches the hills and sets up camp in a strong position, with hills protecting his flanks from cavalry attacks. Then he settles in and waits for reinforcements. By mid-December, the two consuls join forces. Discussing how to confront Hannibal, Scipio argues against taking the field, stressing that Longus's troops lack experience and need additional training, having been raised less than a year ago. Longus disagrees and sets up camp a few kilometers north from Scipio's position. Just as eager to fight as Longus, Hannibal maintains his camp on the flat plain and surveys the potential battlefield west of the Trebia River. Meanwhile, he sends a raiding party to ravage the area along the river, suspecting that Gallic tribes living there, who pledged allegiance to him, are now negotiating with the Romans. It's unclear if the Gauls intended to betray Hannibal, but with their villages now being raided, some of the tribesmen appeal to the Romans for help. Longus promptly sends 1,000 velotus across the river to attack the raiders. With Hannibal's troops scattered across the area and encumbered by plunder, Roman troops start picking off small groups of Carthaginians, quickly routing the raiders. Seeing this, troops on duty outside Hannibal's camp rush to the aid of the retreating raiding party. The fighting is fierce, as both sides want to prove their superiority, but the Roman velotus are soon forced into a fighting retreat. The skirmish escalates rapidly, spreading across a large area. More and more troops from each side join in. Pockets of clashes develop as neither side is able to shore up its ranks. It becomes apparent that the chaotic skirmish might turn into a full-scale battle that neither commander will be able to control. Hannibal takes the initiative. He stops sending more troops into the fray, trying to avoid a battle that he did not plan and can do little to influence. He then audaciously rides out in person and rallies the scattered troops. He pulls them back and arrays them in a line outside the camp. The Romans advance, but Hannibal restrains his men from charging the enemy. The Romans too halt their advance, refusing to attack the well-positioned Carthaginians, who can now be supported from the camp with projectiles and fresh troops. The day draws to a close. Hannibal demonstrates his shrewdness by not committing to an uncertain battle, and by restraining his troops, he exhibits what he would become so famous for: his extraordinary ability to exercise control over his army. Romans retire towards their camp, satisfied at scoring a victory against Hannibal's troops, their morale and confidence partially restored. Longus, who is described by sources as having an aggressive temperament, shows his eagerness to do battle as soon as possible. He won't have to wait long. At dawn, Roman guards sound the alarm. The Carthaginians are attacking the camp. Awoken to projectiles flying over the palisades, Roman troops are ordered to get ready for battle. On empty stomachs, the men rush to form up in front of their tents in frigid conditions. Longus sends all 4,000 of his cavalry against the Numidians, closely followed by 6,000 velotus. But the Numidians soon break off. As the fighting moves north, the fast cavalrymen engage in hit-and-run attacks. Longus marches out with the rest of his army to meet the enemy. Heavy infantry forms into 3 columns, each some 3.5 kilometers long. They lag behind the cavalry and velotus, but make steady progress. Numidians continue to avoid a direct confrontation with the Roman cavalry and velotus. Meanwhile, Hannibal gathers his officers to lay out his plans. He offers words of encouragement and orders them to ready the men for battle. Well-rested and well-fed, Carthaginian troops take to the field. To the east, the skirmish continues. Numidians find themselves backed against the Trebia. They start crossing the river as they continue to pull back, pursued by the Romans. Arriving with the infantry and eager for battle, Longus orders the army to deploy on the western bank. The 3 columns begin crossing, chest deep in the freezing water. Meanwhile, Hannibal sends 8,000 infantry forward to support the Numidian retreat and to provide a screen for his own deployment. He then moves his main line about 1 kilometer towards the approaching Romans. Across the field, Longus's army takes several hours to deploy. After fording the cold Trebia, his men are hungry, soaked, and standing in the near-freezing temperature. The Roman consul places his velotus in the front, forms his veteran infantry in the center, with Gallic and allied infantry on either side, and cavalry on the flanks. Hannibal deploys his infantry in a thin line. Gallic allies in the center, with Spanish and Libyan infantry on either side. Elephants flank the infantry, while the Numidian and Gallic cavalry is further wide. Around noon, Longus orders his entire line to advance, confident in the clear numerical advantage of his heavy infantry. The Romans advance in good order. The flat plain, free of any obstacles, seems an ideal battleground for their style of warfare. Meanwhile, Hannibal holds the line, letting the enemy come to him. Skirmishers get into range and begin exchanging projectiles. With Balearic slingers in their ranks, combining with javelin men, the Carthaginians quickly gain the upper hand against the Roman velitus, who used up many of their javelins while pursuing the Numidian cavalry earlier in the day. Skirmishers from both sides withdraw through the gaps as the main lines of infantry close in. The heavier, more compact Roman infantry pushes the Carthaginian line back, causing heavy casualties to Hannibal's Gallic infantry in the center. On the flanks, Hannibal orders his cavalry to push forward. Some of the Roman horses become frightened by Hannibal's elephants, causing disruption within the ranks. But groups of Roman velitus, specially trained to deal with elephants, mix with the cavalry and attack the terrifying beasts, wounding and killing many. Eventually, the Numidians manage to overwhelm and advance against the Roman cavalry. But despite Roman flanks being pushed back, the Carthaginian center is crumbling. Veteran legionnaires are hacking through the Gallic infantry. Without any reinforcements available, it seems that Hannibal cannot stop the onslaught. But what the Romans don't know is that while surveying the field on the eve of battle, Hannibal personally picked 2,000 elite troops and positioned them in a dry riverbed, hidden from view. Now they emerge from the ravine with perfect timing, just as the Numidians finally rout the Roman cavalry, poised to encircle the enemy. Hard pressed from the front by elephants, Carthaginian infantry and skirmishers, the wings of the Roman infantry buckle as the Numidians attack their rear. Meanwhile, Hannibal's center collapses as the veteran Roman heavy infantry cuts right through the Carthaginian line, still unaffected by the encirclement thanks to their discipline and organization. However, realizing the battle is lost, the legionnaires retreat back across the river to Placentia, maintaining their battle formation. Roman casualties are heavy, likely around 28,000 dead or wounded, while the Carthaginian losses are much lower, between 3,000 and 5,000. Losing most of his elephants, possibly all but one, is the only major loss for Hannibal at Trebia. In just a matter of weeks, Hannibal outperformed both Roman consuls with superior planning, near-perfect coordination, and control of his troops. News of the defeat rocks the Roman Senate and causes widespread panic among the population. The damage to Roman prestige persuades many more Gauls to join Hannibal. Additional attacks on Roman outposts and towns cause further disruption, before cold weather finally forces armies of both sides into winter quarters. But as Hannibal's devastating campaign in Italy gains momentum, a seemingly minor event in Iberia could threaten the Carthaginian war effort in the long run. Early in 217 BC, the Roman Senate is still reeling from the defeat at Trebia. But, determined to strike back at Hannibal, they look to other theaters to try and shift the balance of war. The Roman army that was initially sent to stop the Carthaginian general from reaching Italy is now in Iberia with new objectives, under the command of Gnaeus Scipio. After first arriving in Iberia in early autumn of 218 BC, Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio Calvus defeated and captured Hanno along with thousands of Carthaginian troops. He also seized the rich baggage train that Hannibal left behind when he marched into the Pyrenees Mountains while on his way to Italy. But despite this victory, Gnaeus lost many of his ship crews during Hasdrubal Barca's raid into the Roman enclave, which crippled his fleet. Luckily for the Romans, Hasdrubal was outnumbered 2-1, and he retreated soon after this minor victory, as he could not mount a full-scale offensive. Both generals used the winter months to regroup and plan for the coming year. The Roman general's main objective is to prevent Iberian reinforcements from reaching Hannibal by land. His second objective is to put pressure on Carthaginian holdings in Iberia by any means. From his base at Tarraco, Gnaeus spends months consolidating his position. He reaches out to various tribes to establish friendly relations through diplomacy and trade, and looks to broker alliances by offering the tribes protection against the Carthaginians. It doesn't take too long to persuade many locals to join the Roman cause, because just as most Gauls in Italy hate the Romans, so too the tribes of northern Iberia despise the Carthaginians. And although many communities are still apprehensive about confronting Carthage, especially those on the border, tribes further north of the Ebro eagerly ally themselves to Rome. Gnaeus also strengthens ties with the Greek cities, especially Massilia, a very prosperous city that commits to sending her experienced fleet to help the Romans. And, as promised, Gnaeus detaches garrisons to defend his allies over the coming months. He also garrisons the Ebro River, anticipating an invasion by Hasdrubal Barca in the spring, and arranges the purchase of food and supplies from the locals. In addition, he distributes the plunder taken from Hannibal's baggage train to his army, which boosts his popularity with the troops. Across the Ebro, Hasdrubal Barca posts garrisons along the river to ward off Roman raids, and marches back to his winter quarters in New Carthage. Hasdrubal currently has 15,000 troops at his disposal. But the manpower reserves and the riches of Carthaginian Iberia give Hasdrubal enough muscle to quickly respond to the Roman threat. He spends the winter months resting his army, raising funds for new recruits and stockpiling provisions for the upcoming campaign. Ships are repaired and additional ships are brought in, along with new ship crews, recruited mainly from the Turdetani tribes in southern Iberia. By spring of 217 BC, Hasdrubal musters a large enough army to mount an offensive against Gnaeus. Carthaginians march out of New Carthage. Hasdrubal personally leads the ground forces, while he puts the fleet of 40 ships under the command of Hamilkar. The fleet sails along the coast, closely keeping pace with the army on land, under whose protection the crews can beach their ships every night to rest. While Hasdrubal initially had 15,000 troops after Hannibal departed from Iberia, it is unknown how many new troops he recruited for the campaign of 217 BC. But, considering that Gnaeus received reports from his scouts of the approaching Carthaginians, and yet didn't follow his first instinct to face them in battle, it is safe to assume that the size of Hasdrubal's army was exceedingly strong, which dissuaded the Roman general from giving battle. Furthermore, Hasdrubal could potentially tap into his vast manpower pool, while Gnaeus won't be receiving any reinforcements for at least a year. Another reason for the Roman general to remain cautious. Gnaeus decides to march out of Tarraco and take up a defensive position on the Ebro, with his ships following close by. Aware that the Carthaginian fleet can flank him and cut his supply lines, he handpicks his best troops from the legions and loads them into 35 ships, some of which came from Massilia with their experienced and reputable crews. With his fleet guarding his flank, the Roman general reaches within 15 kilometers of the Ebro. Gnaeus's plan is to concentrate his efforts on the sea. He temporarily stops and sends 2 Massilian ships to scout ahead. With his army vastly outnumbered, he recognizes that if Hasdrubal successfully surrounds or besieges his position, the superior Carthaginian fleet could cut off Roman seaborne supply lines. Therefore, his plan is to deal a knockout blow, or at least cripple the Carthaginian fleet. Massilian scouts soon return with reports that the Carthaginians are encamped at the mouth of the Ebro, their ships still beach and unmanned since the night before. Looking to seize the fortunate opportunity, Gnaeus gives his ships the signal to attack immediately, hoping to catch the enemy off guard. They make haste towards the Ebro, formed in 2 lines. The higher quality Massilian ships are in the front, their crews leading the way, while the Roman ships are formed up behind them. However, Carthaginian scouts along the coast spot the enemy fleet and sound the alarm. Hasdrubal draws up his land forces on the beach and orders Hamilcar to embark his crews and put to sea straight away. The Carthaginians, although caught by surprise, have confidence in their ships. Hasdrubal's troops cheer on the crews as they close the distance to meet the Romans. 2 Massilian ships are intercepted. Hamilcar's men rush to board the enemy vessels. On the right flank, Carthaginian ships double up on the Romans. As they board the enemy, Hamilcar's crews begin overwhelming the Massilians and Romans on the right. Meanwhile, chaotic fighting spreads in the center as the Romans latch onto several enemy vessels. Gnaeus's men are firmly on the back foot and losing ground. The Carthaginians outpaced and outmaneuvered his fleet. But the battle-hardened Roman troops in the center hold their ground. Disciplined and organized, they slowly manage to turn the tide by sheer brute force. The legionnaires begin pushing the Carthaginians back. In the chaotic fighting, they manage to sink 1 Carthaginian ship, together with its entire crew, then another. Some of Hamilcar's men begin to waver. 4 more ships in the center are crippled and left adrift with their oars shattered. Seeing the gaping hole in their line, panic among some of Hamilcar's crews turns into a hasty, disorganized retreat toward the shore. Hasdrubal can only watch as the Romans vigorously pursue his fleet. His troops can do little to help the retreating ships. Ironically, having his army deployed on the beach offered a clear and safe escape route for the ships, which may have motivated some of the crews to flee rather than fight and risk death. This would certainly explain the sudden collapse of morale amongst Hamilcar's men. The Carthaginian fleet finally reaches the shore. Crews beach their ships and hastily disembark, abandoning their vessels in search for safety within Hasdrubal's army. But the Romans aren't done yet. They boldly continue towards the shore, despite the risk of running their ships aground or being attacked by Hasdrubal's troops. To the average observer, it must have seemed like madness to come so close to the shore. But Gnaeus is willing to take the risk. His ships rush in, quickly latching onto Carthaginian vessels that are still seaworthy, and begin towing them away. Seeming stunned, the Carthaginians fail to react in time. By the time they realize what has happened, the Romans sail downstream, having captured 25 of their ships. At first, the defeat at the Ebro seemingly changed little. Over the coming months, Hasdrubal, with his army intact, puts pressure on the tribes to rise against Rome, stretching Gnaeus to the limit. But the Carthaginian general is also forced to deal with revolts in southern Iberia. Both sides spend over a year quelling revolts and regrouping. For the Romans, after a series of defeats suffered against Hannibal in Italy, news of Gnaeus' success is much welcomed by the Senate. Encouraged, they make plans to send reinforcements to Iberia under the command of Gnaeus' brother Publius, whose term as consul ended a few months ago. Fully recovered from his wounds, within a year Publius would arrive with 20 to 30 ships and 8,000 troops, along with food and supplies. However, it is Gnaeus' perseverance at the Ebro that would prove to be the turning point of the war in Iberia. For the next 10 years, the Carthaginian Iberian coast would be undefended. Exposed to Roman raids, Carthage will have to divert a lot of manpower to defend its Iberian towns and countryside. And over the coming years, the Scipio brothers will pose a serious threat to the Carthaginian war effort. Credit goes to our awesome patrons who make videos like this one possible. Consider joining them to support our work. You can also support us by subscribing to our channel and clicking the bell button to get notified when our new videos are released. And as always, thank you for watching.